So that's now the final highlight is coming now with the market for attention with Daniel Chen. Daniel, the floor is yours, and it is recorded, so you could still ask questions. Okay, Daniel.
All right, thanks so much, Marcus. So first of all, let me say it's a real pleasure to be able to present here at the initiative. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion. Now, before I get started, I think I should give you a little bit of a warning. What I'm going to talk about today isn't strictly speaking a macro finance topic. Actually, I'm going to be talking about a topic, platform competition, that has traditionally been studied from a micro theory viewpoint. And I think actually one of the main contributions of the paper I tell you today is to try to bring this problem closer to a macro perspective, because I think that such a perspective has largely been missing from the literature. And hopefully I can help to convince you that this is potentially a fruitful direction for further research. All right, the market for attention. So this is a market that's composed of these competing platforms that profit primarily from the sale of targeted advertising. So I'm talking about companies like Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn, among many others. But for the purposes of today's talk, practically any website on the internet that publishes ads will qualify. So this is a really large and important market. These platforms provide us with a wide variety of valuable services, ranging from language learning with Duolingo, or business networking with LinkedIn, or video content sharing with YouTube. But they also extract hundreds of billions of dollars in ad revenues every year from product firms. And so it's now a major open policy question as to how we should be regulating them. Now, it turns out that that's been a subject of great debate, and I think a lot of the contention is simply because this is a market with a number of unique features which make it difficult to port over the existing principles of competition analysis that we've developed based on more traditional markets. Okay, so first of all, these platforms are often providing their services to consumers at zero prices. Okay, that's been a big hang-up for regulators who have traditionally relied on markups as a gauge of the efficiency of a market, at least according to the FTC chairman, Lina Khan. Rather, it seems like the more relevant dimension along which they're competing isn't pricing, but rather through investment in the quality of their services. These are some of the most investment-intensive companies in the world. And the reason why they want to invest to acquire consumer attention is because they can then monetize it by selling ads to various firms that seek to market their products. And the way they do this is via these dynamic, individualized ad auctions that arise in real time as consumers engage with their services. And because these are individual specific, what these platforms will typically do is they'll gather data on consumers, which they'll then share with various product firms, who can use that data to form beliefs about the tastes of the various consumers and can target their ads accordingly. Okay, and yet despite the widespread use of data for this purpose, firms are generally not personalizing their prices. So when I say the market for attention, I broadly mean a market with these stylized features. And what I hope to do today is just make a little bit of a contribution towards furthering our understanding of this market. And I'll do that by building a new search theoretic model of platform competition. And what's really new about this model is its perspective, which tries to get the different multi-sided market interactions together in one framework. So I'll endogenize outcomes on each of the different market sides, including the product market. The model shows how ad revenues, platform quality, and the allocation in the product market are determined, and how they depend on the data that these platforms are gathering on consumers to target those ads, and also the interoperability among platforms. That is the extent to which these platforms can work with each other, and users can easily shift their attention among them. Okay, such a model is ideally suited to analyzing the welfare impacts of platforms from their two productive roles, which is to provide quality services and to mitigate product market frictions by advertising. Okay, and I'll use the model to study the effects of policies like those on data and interoperability, Okay, these are some of the leading policy tools of this market. I'll study their effects on the whole economic system at once. And the main methodological contribution is to show how something like this can be done in a tractable way. Okay. The main takeaway is that a broad, multi-sided perspective seems essential if we really want to have a practical understanding of this market. I'll show that once you account for each of the different market sides, the effects of various policies can flip. The short-run effects of policies may differ substantially from the long-run effects, as the effects of those policies gradually propagate across the market sides. And I'll show in general there are going to be non-trivial trade-offs. For example, a social planner is going to have to trade off between allocative efficiency in the product market and platform quality. And an adequate welfare analysis should take into account those trade-offs. Okay. In the interest of time, I won't go deeply into the related literature. I contribute or relate to a couple of different literatures on platforms and two-sided markets, advertising, ad auctions, and competing auctions. Again, I think the main novelty here is a perspective that tries to get in a unified framework each of the different market sides. Okay, so let me jump into the baseline model. I consider an economy in which there are consumers, firms, and platforms. There is a continuum of each of them, and I'll normalize the measure of consumers to 1. Okay, so let's consider a typical consumer, I, represented by this white dot. This consumer is going to be aware of only a strict subset of the firms in the economy at any given point in time t. Omega IT, that's the consumer's consideration set. And it will evolve over time in a manner that I'll describe shortly. Now, at any given point in time, the consumer must choose how much to purchase of each of the different products in her consideration set. So here,Cijt is the demand for product J at time t. And naturally, these demands are going to depend on the consumer's idiosyncratic tastes for the different products in the economy. So here, Vij is her value for product J. It's drawn IID from a given CDF, capital P, supported on the positive real line with a finite mean. Okay, so the consumer has tastes, chooses her demands. Naturally, these demands should also condition on the prices, which are set by the various firms in the economy. So here, PJT is the price set by firm J at time t. What I've just described for you is essentially a standard model of a product market. The only twist here is the limited awareness of the consumers of the different firms in the economy. And that's going to give rise to a market for attention. So at any given point in time, a consumer will have a fixed unit of attention that she may split across the different platforms in the economy. So here, XIKT is the infinitesimal share of attention that's spent on platform K at time t. If you integrate these x's over the set of platforms, they integrate to 1. Okay. Now, she's spending her attention on the different platforms because she derives flow utility from using them. And how much flow utility she gets is going to depend on the effective quality levels of these platforms. So that depends on 2 things. The first is QKT, that's the intrinsic quality of the platform, how enjoyable the content is, how easy to use the user interface is, etc. This other component corresponds to the disutility of the consumer from viewing ads. So here, AKT is the rate at which platform K shows ads. And nu, for nuisance, is a function that's decreasing and is continuous and non-negative. Okay, so these consumers, they allocate attention based on effective quality of the platforms. In order to try and acquire more attention, these platforms will have incentives to invest to maintain the quality of their services. So here, LKT is the investment by platform K at time t. Phi is a parameter less than 1 that ensures that there are decreasing returns to scale to investment. Delta is the depreciation rate, as say the content of a platform grows stale or less relevant over time. That's just a modeling device to ensure a long-run stationary level of quality in the economy. Short.
So what is new AKT again?
So new AKT captures the nuisance cost of viewing ads. So new is a function that's decreasing, and AKT, that's the rate at which a platform shows ads. So for example, on Facebook, you often see ads interspersed with organic content. How much organic content is there between the ads you can think of kind of as like proxying for AKT. Okay. So why do these platforms want to attract attention in the first place? Well, it's going to determine the rate at which a given platform K can display ads to the consumer. So in particular, an ad opportunity will arise on that platform at the tick times of a Poisson process that ticks at a rate that scales with the attention it receives from the consumer, where the scaling rate is the ad rate, AKT. That's the rate at which ads are shown per unit of attention. Okay, so let's suppose that at time t, an ad opportunity has arrived. What will this platform do? It's going to choose a finite number n of firms from outside the consideration set of the consumer, uniformly at random, to submit bids in a second price auction with no reserve price. All of the results I tell you today will extend in the sense of revenue equivalence to any standard auction format, even though we're in a dynamic setting. Okay, so this parameter n, that's an exogenous integer. It's supposed to capture latency constraints that limit the number of feasibly participating bidders in these auctions. Okay, these auctions have to be run within the blink of an eye, and so it's just not feasible for the platform to invite every firm in the economy. So you should think of these n firms as those which are able to respond in that 100 milliseconds or so to the bid request from the platform. Now, why are these firms chosen from outside the consideration set of the consumer? That's just to get a little added tractability so I can get closed form solutions for equilibrium bidding strategies. None of the results I tell you today will hinge on it. In reality, these platforms typically do have some information about consumers' consideration sets, which they can use to tailor their auction invitations. For example, typically they'll put tracking pixels on firms' retail websites that tell them when a consumer is no longer visiting that website and likely no longer holds those products in consideration. Sure.
So for consumer eye, what firms he know and what firms he doesn't know is a common knowledge in this economy, you assume?
I don't think you need full common knowledge. I think I'm assuming for this baseline model that the platforms are aware of the consideration set of the consumer. I don't think it's necessary for the firms themselves to know that.
And even based on this assumption, is it essential or too strong? I mean.
Oh yeah, so that's a fair question. I do think it's an extreme assumption. I think an equally extreme assumption would be to assume that the platforms know nothing about consideration sets. Probably you could solve a version of the model with a more intermediate assumption on like maybe they have some information about consideration sets but don't know everything. That maybe you could likely solve a version. It's just this way I get analytical solutions that are basically in closed form. Yes?
Isn't utility advertising, is this like a necessary assumption to get the results? Because I could imagine that I like to follow car brands in Instagram, so I have kind of like a single picture represent some amount of advertising I actually enjoy.
Right, so I'm taking kind of a classical view of advertising here, which is it purely plays an informative role. I think that by taking a classical viewpoint, it allows me to put the emphasis on the market structure, which is really the main novelty here. I do think like those considerations are interesting and important potentially, and one could integrate them building on this framework. But as a starting point, this seemed to be a logical way to go, which is to, yeah.
Can your model also accommodate that the consumer's utility of the platform will depend whether other consumers are using it?
That's a fantastic question. So what you're talking about is essentially a network effect. And I don't do it in the baseline model, but in an extension, I show how you can extend the model to incorporate that effect. And it's just as tractable as the baseline model. And all of the main results go through. Yes?
So just to confirm, related to the previous question, there's just basically the consumer learns about the product, but there's no increasing likelihood that they purchase the product from seeing more ads about the same firm?
Right. This is not a paper where advertising changes the tastes of consumers over time. Now, I do think that's potentially important, but I'm shutting it down for a baseline. Okay. Now, for these firms to figure out how they should be bidding on a consumer, they need to form some beliefs about the tastes of the consumer. Okay, and typically what happens is these platforms give them data along with those bid requests on the consumer's location or age, etc., which they can use to form those beliefs. I'm not going to take a stand on explicitly modeling the data. It turns out for this model, it suffices to only keep track of firms' posterior expectations of consumers' values, given that information they might receive. And so we're going to assume that firm J's expectation, V hat ij, of consumerized value is drawn IID from a given CDFG, which is a mean preserving contraction of the prior P. Because we know by Blackwell that's a necessary and sufficient condition for there to exist some underlying data or signal structures that generates those beliefs. So we're modeling data completely non-parametrically here. All right, so these firms, they observe their expectations, then they condition their bids on those expectations. Let's suppose that this top firm is the highest bidding one. It's then going to enter the consideration set of the consumer at the end of the instant after displaying its ad. Okay? But it's not going to stay there forever. Firms are going to be forgotten at independent exponential times with rate lambda f. That's just to ensure that frictions persist in the long run. Okay, but it also delivers the real-world feature that ads are often retargeted to the same consumers over and over again. Okay. Oh, I should also mention, I may refer to G as data as we go along in the talk, and I'll say data is more informative when G increases in the mean preserving spread order. Okay, you'll also notice that G does not depend on which platform the firm is bidding on. That's equivalent to assuming that all platforms have the same data on consumers. Later on, I'll show you what happens when I allow for heterogeneity in data across platforms. Okay, so this is the structure of the economy. I have to fill in some remaining details. So I'll assume that a consumer's flow utility is an increasing function U of CES aggregates of product consumption and platform consumption. Okay, these are value and quality adjusted respectively. And here the exponent sigma is substitutability among products, and the exponent rho is substitutability among platforms. Now you might notice that the exponent on value and quality, those look a little bit asymmetric. That's just a convenient normalization to reduce notation. It's without loss of generality later on. Okay, so that's consumers' preferences. Firms and platforms are simply profit maximizers. And everyone will discount time at a common rate R. So an equilibrium of this model is a collection of processes for product demands, platform demands, the measure of varieties in consumers' consideration sets, which I'll denote by MT. These aren't indexed by I because they'll be common to all consumers, it turns out. The CDF of the expected values of consumers for those varieties, HT. These two objects will be sufficient statistics for consideration sets for us to solve for equilibrium. Okay, prices set by firms, their bidding strategies, the rates at which platforms display ads, the rates at which they invest, and also their quality levels, such that firms, consumers, and platforms are all optimizing, and such that the properties of these consideration sets and platform quality levels each satisfy their respective laws of motion, and that they're going to be consistent with the bidding strategies of firms and the ad rates and investment rates set by platforms. Okay, so that's an equilibrium of this model. So you might notice there's an asterisk on optimizing. I'm going to make a slight simplifying assumption, which is that the consumers in the model, they don't allocate their attention for the express purpose of seeing ads to influence the future evolution of their consideration sets. In equilibrium, it will turn out that all platforms display ads at the same rate, and so how they choose to split their attention doesn't really matter. So this myopia is in fact dynamically optimal, but we're restricting attention to equilibria with this property. Okay? So even with that simplifying assumption, solving for equilibrium looks like it's going to be a mess. The product market allocations, investment rates, bidding strategies, consideration sets, all of these things are kind of mutually determined, and the agents in the economy have to rationally anticipate them, how they will evolve going forward. So how are we going to untangle this mess? Well, I'll give you a sketch of how we solve the model. And you'll see that the way we've set it up is in such a way that we can preserve the interactions among the different market sides, but we make them as minimal as possible in some sense. Okay, so, yes?
If I understand correctly, if a firm moves into the consideration set, you get increased utility just from a larger set of varieties.
That's true.
And you don't have a budget set in the background.
So you mean
So
like,
that's going to matter for the welfare analysis here.
you mean like a budget constraint?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I didn't explicitly state it, but in the background, consumers, they have income and they can only spend. Yeah, so there's a budget constraint. I didn't explicitly show it.
But you still have that scaling varieties
Yes.
effect explicitly.
Yes.
So in that sense, if you want to compare this to like the Rachel paper, X is sort of equivalent to leisure, and it's going to be taken out of consumption.
Yeah, I'd say that would be a good analogy. Okay, equilibrium. So under some technical parameter conditions stated formally in the paper, there exists a unique equilibrium, and this equilibrium will eventually converge to a steady state and has the following 8 properties, which I've left blank. So what I'm going to go through now is filling in each of these 8 different properties, and hopefully I can give you a sense of why they look the way they do and how they were derived, so we can build up some intuition to understand the results later on in the talk. So first is consumers' demands. Their CES preferences will imply CES demands. So consumer I's demand for product J is increasing in her income and her value for that product, but it's decreasing in the values of the rival products in the consideration set. Similarly, consumer I's demand for platform K is increasing in the effective quality of that platform, but decreasing in the effective qualities of the rival platforms in the economy. And when platforms are more substitutable, attention is going to be more sensitive to platform quality. Now, given consumers' demands, we can write down a firm's flow profit from selling to the consumer. That's just the demand times the markup, where here 1 is the constant marginal cost of production. You can think of it as the numeraire in the economy, so I set it to 1. Now, what I want you to notice is that the consumer's value and the consideration set and the values of the other firms in that set, all of that only appears in a term that merely scales demand by the same factor for any given price that the firm sets. And so what this means is that the firm's optimal price is chosen just to maximize these terms in red. And so that gives a very familiar expression for the optimal price, which is just the constant markup that's determined only by the substitutability among products. And in particular, this same price is optimal for any given consumer in the economy. So that means it's in fact optimal for firms not to personalize their prices in this model. Okay. Now, of course, there may be reasons other than this one for why firms are not generally personalizing prices in reality. This is just a convenient way for us to, well, A, get tractability, but also shut down any welfare effects of personalized pricing which is simply not a prevalent practice. Okay. Now we can solve for the ad frequency set by these platforms in much the same way. All right, each platform is going to choose an ad frequency to maximize its flow profits, which is equal to the expected ad price, which I denote by pi, multiplied by the overall rate at which ads are displayed, which is the ad frequency, AKT, multiplied by the attention that we just solved for. Okay, now if you take a look at this object, you'll notice that the ad frequency that maximizes it, well, is going to be determined just by this term here on the right. And so we see that each platform is going to set an ad frequency, capital A, which is constant over time and depends only on the nuisance cost function and also the substitutability among platforms. Okay. And it's going to be useful to know the following fact for intuition later on, which is that when platforms are more substitutable, they're going to set lower ad frequencies because consumer attention is more sensitive to ad rates, and so they can steal attention from each other more easily by reducing their ad rates. Okay. Now, given the ad frequency, we already have enough information to solve for the size and the composition of these consideration sets. So let me remind you that MT was the measure of varieties in the set. HT was the CDF of the expected values of the products in that set. And let me define HTC to be the CDF of the expected values in the complement outside the set. Okay. Now, it turns out we can actually solve for these objects by keeping track of inflows and outflows. So the overall rate at which firms exit the consideration set is simply the rate at which they're forgotten, multiplied by the overall measure inside the set. And the overall rate of inflow is simply the ad frequency. Now the CDF of the expected values of these firms which are flowing out is simply the CDF in the set, because they're forgotten uniformly at random. Now, to determine the inflow, the distribution of the inflow, we have to take a stand on who's going to be the winners in those ad auctions. And it's going to turn out in equilibrium that the winners are going to be those firms with the highest expected values for the consumer. And so the rate of inflow, the distribution of the inflow, is just the first order statistic of n independent draws from the CDF outside the consideration set. Now, one can write down the differential equations governing these dynamics, and it turns out they have explicit solutions. So here's the measure of varieties in the consideration set. As you can see, it's increasing in the ad rate, and it's decreasing in the forget rate. And it asymptotes to the ratio of those two objects, so it's very intuitive, simple. Now, given M, we can solve for the CDF HTC. It's characterized implicitly by the following equation. It's not too important to know the details of this equation, but you can see consumer data is going to appear. Naturally, that'll affect the CDFs. And given MT and HTC, we can get the CDF inside the set from accounting, because at the end of the day, the CDF inside the set added to the CDF outside the set, weighted by the measures in those sets, must coincide with the overall population CDF, which is G. Okay, so the point of all this is just to say that we can get a clean map from things like the ad frequency and data to the size and composition of consideration sets. And we can derive a number of interesting comparative statics. It's going to suffice for the rest of the talk for intuition to just know the following one, which is that when platforms display more ads or when data is more informative, then it turns out that the cumulative value of the firms inside of the consideration set actually increases. And that's going to turn out to be a sufficient statistic for aggregate product consumption. So product consumption improves when that happens. Okay. Now, before we can solve for a firm's optimal bidding strategy, I have to tell you, they have to assess their expected flow profits from selling to a consumer. Right, that part's obvious, but also they have to assess their match rates with the consumer, how quickly they can enter the consumer's consideration set, because that's going to determine the value of the outside option to a firm to wait to bid in future ad auctions. Okay, that's what's making the problem dynamic. So given what we just computed on the previous slide, it's straightforward to show that a firm's expected flow profit from selling to a consumer is linear in its expected value to the consumer with a coefficient pi that's decreasing in the cumulative value of the firms inside of the consideration set. So here, mu ht, that's the mean of the CDFH. Okay, and this is intuitive. If a firm faces stronger competition in the consideration set, it's going to earn less flow profits. And importantly, these firms are going to internalize that effect when they bid. That's something that's missing from a lot of the literature. And you'll see that this additional effect can reverse some comparative statics. Now, it's also easy to write down a firm's Poisson rate of entry into a consumer's consideration set. That's just the overall rate at which they enter these ad auctions, which is, well, the rate at which ad auction invitations are sent out, which is the number of bidders per auction multiplied by the overall ad rate, normalized by the measure of firms which are eligible to actually enter those auctions, which remain outside the consideration set. Okay, and it's multiplied by the probability that a firm wins an auction, which is just the probability that it has a higher expected value than the n-1 other bidders in that auction. All right. So we can write down the firm's, oh, sorry, yes?
So if I understand correctly, there's no scale effect for the firm, in the sense that the bidding decision of the firm doesn't depend on the number of consideration sets to which it belongs to, right? Is that correct?
Sorry, could you repeat that last part?
The bidding strategy of the firm doesn't depend on the number of consideration sets to which it belongs, in the sense that it doesn't depend on the size of the market for that firm.
That's going to be true. Because they're bidding consumer by consumer, it's as though you can solve their bidding strategies consumer by consumer. Yes. Okay. So one can write down the HJB equations for a firm's dynamic bidding problem. And it turns out they have a really clean explicit solution. So as you can see here, the bid, okay, so this is a function that takes as input the expected value of the consumer and outputs how much the firm should bid. As you can see, it's increasing in the coefficient on the flow profits that they make from selling to that consumer, which is intuitive. But it's decreasing in the rates at which they match with the consumer. That increases the effective discount rate. Right? So when there's less frictions in the economy, these firms are going to bid less aggressively on consumers. And that's not a contrived prediction of the model, by the way. There are many analysts at Facebook, figuring out algorithms to figure out how to optimally shade their bids in anticipation of the outside option to bid in future auctions. And that's captured here through the coefficient lambda e. Given the bid functions, it's straightforward to compute the expected ad price. That's just the expectation of the second highest bid in the auction. Okay? And even though these match rates are endogenous objects, it's useful to think about what might happen if we send them to infinity at every point in time so that these frictions disappear in the limit. And in the limit, well, consideration sets will grow to contain all firms. And you can see here that the average ad price is going to converge to 0. So we recover a classical frictionless economy in the limit, where it's as though there are no platforms. Okay, so now, given the path of future ad prices, platforms must solve for their optimal dynamic investment decision. And using Pontryagin's maximum principle, we can derive an ODE for investment. Okay, we hear quality, let me remind you, evolves according to this equation. And one can show that there's a unique solution to this ODE system that is consistent with an equilibrium. And in that solution, investment must eventually converge to a steady state level L star. So while this ODE system isn't super intuitive, the steady state level of investment is pretty intuitive. It's increasing in the ad revenue, okay? And it's increasing in rho minus 1, which determines the sensitivity of attention to platform quality, right? So together, these two objects determine the value to a platform of being able to invest to steal attention and a little bit of ad revenue away from its rivals. Okay, and these business stealing externalities turn out to have important implications for welfare in the model. And I discussed that in the paper, but we likely won't be able to get to it in the talk today. All right, so from here, it's a matter of accounting to, oh, yes?
Sorry, I thought, wouldn't it make a bit more intuitive sense to have platform quality be increasing returns to having attention or data?
Yeah, I think that's, so what you're suggesting is that if they get, they have higher quality, then they'll maybe gather more attention, which could then impact their data. Yeah, I think that's a reasonable approximation of like what's going on in reality. I'm missing that effect in the paper. In fact, one of the main things we're going to study is what happens when data G changes exogenously. So that's like one of our main policy experiments. But I do think incorporating how attention can affect data endogenously could be an interesting thing to study in future work. Yes?
So in some sense, the more that is invested overall in platform quality, the more attention consumers devote to it, the less they have to allocate to actual consumption and the less productive activity there is in the economy on some level.
So that's an interesting channel, and I've actually explored that in notes that I've taken outside, like that aren't actually in the paper. Right now, attention, there's product consumption doesn't require any attention in this model. So you don't have that effect going on here. But that's interesting, yeah, and I've explored that. Okay, so as a matter of accounting, one can write down the surpluses of the different agents. The only thing I want to draw your attention to here is the fact that aggregate product consumption depends on only the cumulative value of firms in the consideration set, not the whole CDF. So it's a simple thing to keep track of. All right, comparative statics. So I've given you a sense of what the equilibrium looks like and roughly why it looks that way. What we're going to do now is explore some comparative statics results related to two policy experiments on interoperability and data. Okay, these are some of the leading regulatory tools in the market. Many of these policies have already been passed into law. For example, GDPR and is data privacy law, and the Digital Markets Act, which will go into effect shortly, will regulate interoperability among platforms. So these are really important things we should have an understanding of. All right. So the first experiment we're going to consider is related to enforcing interoperability among platforms. So usually the logic behind those policies is that by making these platforms more interoperable, consumers can shift their attention more easily among them, the market's more contestable, and so there's going to be more competition. And so we're going to capture that through a shock to platform substitutability. So let's suppose at time 0, the economy begins in steady state, but at time 1, the government, let's say, enforces these new interoperability policies that make platforms enact technological changes such that the substitutability among their services increases by 1%. Okay, what's going to happen? Well, it turns out that immediately after the shock, ad revenue actually declines. Okay, this is because these platforms are more substitutable. They reduce their ad rates so that they can steal attention from each other. And the reduction in ad rates means less ads are sold, and that effect causes ad revenues to decline. However, over time, the reduction in ad frequency causes the consideration sets of consumers to shrink. And so firms face less competition in the product market, and so they bid more aggressively because their flow profits go up. And this causes ad revenue to actually increase in the long run. So the short-run effect can be very misleading. Now, given these results for ad revenue, the effects on investment are pretty intuitive. Investment will decline in the short run because there's less incentive. You get less ad revenues from having more attention. and it increases in the long run because ad revenues go up and there's more incentives to invest. Okay, but contrary to the popular intuition, investment actually does go down in the short run, right? The whole intuition for these policies is it's going to promote investment. And so I think that's something regulators should be aware of. Now, what happens to platform quality? Well, in the short run, investment's lower, so quality gets worse. But in the long run, it improves. So the long run effects are consistent with what the regulators are saying. Product consumption, however, gets worse. And that's simply because of the reduction in ad rates. Consumers discover fewer products. And so there's a non-trivial trade-off between platform quality and product consumption, and regulators should take that into account. By the way, these results hold more generally, and I've proven them. They're formal propositions and statements in the paper. All right, so now let's consider a policy experiment related to data. Let's suppose at time 1, the CDF of firms' expectations of consumers' values is uniform on point 2 to point 8. But let's say the government decides to roll back privacy measures. And so now these platforms get access to more data, and after firms condition on that new data, their beliefs get more dispersed. It increases in the mean preserving spread order. So now data, G prime, is such that it's uniform on 0, 1. What will happen? Well, turns out in the short run, pretty intuitively, when you give platforms more data, ad revenue gets better, right? They improve the matching of firms and consumers, and they can extract some fraction of that surplus in those ad auctions. But perhaps counterintuitively, actually ad revenue gets worse in the long run. Right? This is an effect that you wouldn't get this in most standard models that don't model each of the different market sides together. And the reason is, when you get better data, the product market gets more competitive in the sense that those consideration sets are composed of higher, more valued firms. And that reduces the flow profits to product firms, and so they bid less in those ad auctions, and ad revenue decreases in the long run. Investment, however, decreases the whole way through because, well, this blip in ad revenue is pretty short. So the overall decline in ad revenue leads platforms to have less incentives to invest. So I think this really shows how important it is to consider, the different market sides together. You can get counterintuitive results. The decline in investment leads platform quality to get worse. Product consumption, however, improves because better data means a better matching of firms and consumers. So again, you have this trade-off between platform quality and product consumption, and that should be taken into account. Now, this long-run decline in ad revenue might seem pretty counterintuitive, right? Because we often think of data as being integral to the profitability of these platforms. To be clear here, I'm changing the data of all platforms in the economy at once. The individual platforms still gain from having better data. It's just if they could collude to have worse data, they would prefer that. But let me give a little bit more suggestive evidence in support of the mechanisms behind that result. So Silk et al. Document that the market share of digital advertising has grown dramatically in the past decade at the expense of traditional advertising. So I think we would all agree with that. However, it turns out that advertising revenue as a fraction of GDP has actually been historically stable and has actually declined in the past decade a little bit. Even so, we've seen the rapid rise of these digital platforms. So they say, perhaps the most puzzling feature is that the rapid growth of digital advertising has occurred over a period during which the share of US economic activity represented by total ad expenditures has been in decline. Well, it turns out that a version of my model can qualitatively match these trends. Once I extend the model to include two groups of platforms which differ in the quality of their data. And if we interpret those platforms with worse data as traditional platforms, what we'll see is that increasing the informativeness of data of one group of platforms actually raises their ad revenues, and yet total ad expenditures as a fraction of GDP actually goes down because precisely of the effect on competition in the product market. So I won't be able to give you a full description of the extension, but here's the setting for the numerical example that I'll show you. So I extend the analysis of steady state to a setup where consumers' values are log normal. Okay, so Vij is e to the Zij, where Zij is Gaussian. There are two groups of platforms of equal size. Platforms in group 1 receive a signal of Zij that's additive with a noise that's Gaussian and scaled up by delta. Okay, platforms in group 2 also receive additive signals. The only difference is that group 1 platforms are relatively data rich in comparison because the coefficient delta is less than 1, so they receive less noisy data. So we want to interpret these group 1 platforms as digital platforms, which are very sophisticated. And group 2 platforms, they represent traditional media. So as we change delta such that the informativeness of the data of group 1 platforms increases, they have a better data advantage, what we see is that their share of ad revenue actually increases, right? That's consistent with the first fact. However, overall ad revenue declines. Again, this was because of the effect of competition in the product market. And most other models which are missing that effect can't capture both of these trends together. Okay. All right, let me just make a couple of brief statements before I conclude. So in the paper, I do a welfare analysis. I solve the problem of a social planner who must select the rates at which platforms display ads and invest in their services, taking into account the delicate balance of trade-offs across the different market sides. Okay, I characterize, I derive easy sufficient conditions to check when investment in platform services is excessive or insufficient, and which can be used to kind of gauge the overall efficiency of the market. I also explore several extensions. I allow for network effects, where how much utility a consumer gets from using a platform depends on the attention allocation of the other consumers. I allow for firm and platform entry. I allow for these platforms to possibly set positive prices. And I show that under certain conditions, it's going to be an endogenous outcome that they choose not to set positive prices. The model can tractably handle each of these different extensions. So let me now just conclude. So today I presented you a new model of platform competition that emphasizes the interactions among the different sides of the market, including the product market. Okay, this is, I would argue, been a relatively missing perspective in the literature so far. And the results seem to suggest that such a perspective could be very important. Seemingly intuitive comparative statics based on single-sided reasoning can flip. The long-run effects of policies may look completely different from the short-run effects. And generally speaking, there are going to be non-trivial trade-offs among the different market sides. Okay, and so policymakers should take that into account. And given the model's tractability and flexibility, I think there's great potential for future work to build on this framework. And so thank you very much for your attention.